Robert Chen never thought his weekend hobby would land him in the middle of a neighborhood war. The 52-year-old software engineer had moved to Willowbrook Estates 3 years ago, drawn by the promise of peaceful suburban living. The community sat on the outskirts of Denver, where manicured lawns met rolling hills, and every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. When Robert bought his corner lot, he fell in love with the extra space it provided. The previous owner had left behind a small barn structure that most people assumed was decorative. Robert saw potential. Growing up on his grandfather's farm in Nebraska, he remembered the satisfaction of working with his hands, of creating something useful from raw materials. The idea started small. Robert began researching sustainable farming practices during his lunch breaks at work. He read about urban agriculture, about people growing food in their backyards, about the rising cost of organic produce. His wife Lisa thought he was going through a midlife crisis when he announced he wanted to start a small hay operation. Their daughter Jenny, home from college for winter break, found the whole thing amusing. She watched her father measure and remeasure the backyard, sketching plans on napkins during dinner. Robert talked about soil composition and grass varieties with the enthusiasm most men reserved for sports teams. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had rules, of course. Robert spent hours reading through the covenant documents, highlighting relevant sections with a yellow marker. The rules mentioned landscaping standards, fence heights, and paint colors. They talked about maintaining property values and neighborhood aesthetics. But nowhere in the thick binder of regulations did he find anything specifically prohibiting agriculture. Robert started small that first spring. He planted a test patch of timothy grass and alfalfa in the back corner of his lot, near the old barn. His neighbors barely noticed. The HOA president, Margaret Wellington, lived 2 streets over and rarely ventured past the community mailboxes. The grass grew better than Robert expected. By midsummer, he had enough growth to justify buying a small tractor. Lisa rolled her eyes when the bright red machine arrived on a trailer, but she had to admit there was something charming about watching Robert puttering around their backyard like a gentleman farmer. The first harvest came in late July. Robert cut, dried and baled 12 small bales of hay. The satisfaction he felt loading them into the barn was unlike anything he experienced debugging computer code. This was tangible, real, something he could touch and smell and be proud of. Word spread through the neighborhood that the quiet computer guy had become a farmer. Some neighbors stopped by to watch Robert work. The Hendersons from next door brought their kids over to see the tractor. Old Pete Morrison, a retired rancher who lived at the end of the street, offered advice about proper drying techniques. By the second year, Robert had expanded his operation. He researched state agricultural programs and discovered that Colorado offered incentives for small-scale hay producers who met certain quality standards. The paperwork was extensive, but Robert approached it with the same methodical precision he brought to software development. The state inspector, who came to evaluate Robert's operation, was impressed. The hay quality exceeded standards, and Robert's record-keeping was meticulous. Within 6 weeks, Robert received official certification as a state-approved hay supplier. The certificate arrived in a heavy envelope with the Colorado state seal, and Robert hung it proudly in his home office. The third year brought challenges Robert hadn't anticipated. A late spring frost damaged some of his crop, and equipment repairs ate into his modest profits. But he persevered, driven by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The work connected him to something larger than quarterly earnings reports and software updates. By autumn of that third year, Robert's operation had grown to produce nearly 100 bales annually. He supplied hay to 3 local horse stables and had a waiting list of customers. The state renewed his certification, praising his sustainable farming practices and quality control measures. The problem started when Margaret Wellington decided to run for re-election as HOA president. She had held the position for 6 years, ruling the community with an iron fist disguised as concern for property values. But this year she faced opposition from younger residents who thought the rules had become too restrictive. Margaret needed a cause, something to demonstrate her vigilance in protecting the community's character. She began driving through the neighborhood with fresh eyes, looking for violations she might have missed. Paint that was slightly off approved colors, mailboxes that didn't match the approved style, gardens that exceeded permitted sizes. When Margaret turned onto Roberts Street one crisp October morning, she saw something that made her slam on her brakes. There, stacked neatly against the side of the old barn, were dozens of hay bales. Round, golden cylinders that definitely didn't appear in any approved landscaping guide. Margaret parked her silver sedan and walked closer. The bales were organized in perfect rows, clearly not just scattered farming debris. This was intentional, systematic, commercial, and in Margaret's mind, absolutely unacceptable for a residential neighborhood that prided itself on suburban elegance. She took photos with her phone, documenting what she saw as a clear violation of community standards. The hay bales might look quaint to some people, but Margaret saw them as the first step toward neighborhood deterioration. First hay bales, then what? Chicken coops? Vegetable stands? Before long, Willowbrook Estates would look like some rural farming community, instead of the upscale suburb residents had paid premium prices to join. That afternoon, Margaret called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. The 5 members gathered in the community center, a small building that served as the neighborhood's official meeting place. Margaret spread her photos across the conference table like evidence in a criminal case. The board members had mixed reactions. 2 supported Margaret's position immediately, seeing the hay bales as a clear aesthetic violation. 1 member suggested they should investigate further before taking action. Another wondered if there might be agricultural exemptions they weren't aware of, but Margaret had already made up her mind. She had researched removal companies and gotten quotes for hauling away the offensive bales. In her view, the HOA had both the authority and the responsibility to maintain community standards, even if that meant taking decisive action. The first warning letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked between Robert's electric bill and a grocery store circular. The official HOA letterhead made it look important, but Robert almost threw it away, assuming it was another community newsletter about upcoming social events. When he finally opened the envelope that evening, Robert had to read the letter twice to understand what it was saying. The language was formal and threatening, full of phrases like immediate compliance and violation of community standards. According to the letter, his hay bales constituted an unauthorized commercial operation and a visual blight on the neighborhood. Robert sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter in disbelief. Lisa read it over his shoulder, her expression shifting from confusion to anger. Jenny, visiting for the weekend, grabbed the letter and read portions aloud in a mocking voice that made the HOA's demands sound even more ridiculous. The letter gave Robert 30 days to remove all hay bales from his property. Failure to comply would result in fines starting at $500 per week, with the possibility of the HOA taking direct action to remedy the violation at Robert's expense. Robert's first instinct was to call Margaret Wellington directly. He found her number in the community directory and dialed, expecting to clear up what had to be a misunderstanding. When Margaret answered, her voice was cold and professional. She listened to Robert explain his state certification, his years of operation without complaints, the agricultural nature of his work. Margaret's responses were clipped and unsympathetic. The community covenants were clear about maintaining residential character, she said. Commercial operations were prohibited regardless of state permits or certifications. Robert tried to explain that his hay production wasn't really commercial in the traditional sense. He sold bales to cover his costs, but the operation was more hobby than business. Margaret cut him off, stating that any exchange of money for goods constituted commercial activity. The conversation ended with Margaret suggesting Robert consult the community covenants if he had questions about the regulations. She hung up before Robert could respond, leaving him holding the phone and wondering how his peaceful farming hobby had suddenly become a neighborhood crisis. That weekend, Robert walked his property with fresh eyes, trying to see it as Margaret might. The hay bales were neat and orderly, stacked against the barn where they were barely visible from the street. The fields where he grew his crops looked like well-maintained grass areas to casual observers. The tractor was stored inside the barn, out of sight. But the financial loss wasn't the worst part. Robert felt violated, as if strangers had entered his home and destroyed his possessions. The hay bales represented hundreds of hours of work, from preparing soil to harvesting crops to carefully monitoring the drying process. 3 years of building relationships with customers, of perfecting his farming techniques, of finding satisfaction in work that connected him to the land. Jenny suggested they contact local news stations about the story. The image of an HOA stealing a farmer's hay bales might generate enough public pressure to force some accountability. Robert was initially reluctant to make their private dispute public, but Lisa supported Jenny's idea. The first reporter who came to interview Robert was skeptical. HOA disputes were common, and most involved petty complaints that made both sides look foolish. But as Robert explained his state certification, his years of operation without problems, and the sudden escalation to theft, the reporter's interest grew. The story that aired 3 days later was more sympathetic than Robert had expected. The reporter had done her homework, interviewing neighbors who supported Robert's farming operation and researching the legal issues around agricultural activities in residential areas. The segment portrayed Robert as a responsible small farmer being bullied by an overzealous HOA. Margaret Wellington declined to be interviewed for the story, but the HOA issued a written statement defending their actions. The statement emphasized their responsibility to maintain community standards and suggested that Robert had been given ample opportunity to comply with regulations. The news coverage generated immediate responses from viewers. Robert received dozens of phone calls and emails from people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Several farmers offered to help him restart his operation. A few lawyers suggested they might be willing to take his case on contingency. But the most interesting response came from the Colorado Department of Agriculture. A supervisor named David Park called Robert the day after the news story aired. Park explained that the department had been following the case because of Robert's state certification status. According to Park, the state took threats to certified agricultural operations seriously. If an HOA was interfering with legitimate farming activities, especially those recognized by state programs, the department might have grounds to intervene. Park asked Robert to document everything about his interaction with the HOA and promised to research what protections might be available. Meanwhile, Robert's neighbors were beginning to organize. Old Pete Morrison had been quietly talking to other residents about Margaret's heavy-handed leadership style. The hay bale incident had crystallized concerns that many people had been reluctant to voice publicly. A group of neighbors asked Robert to attend an informal meeting at Pete's house. About 20 residents gathered in Pete's living room, including several Robert had never spoken with before. The conversation revealed widespread frustration with Margaret's management of the HOA. The Martinez family shared their story about being fined for parking their catering van in their own driveway. The Hendersons described months of harassment over the color of their front door trim. Several residents had received violation notices for landscaping choices that seemed perfectly reasonable to everyone except Margaret. Pete Morrison had been researching HOA law and discovered that board members could be held personally liable for actions that exceeded their authority. If the HOA had stolen Robert's hay bales without proper legal justification, Margaret and the other board members might face personal financial consequences. The group decided to organize a petition calling for Margaret's resignation and demanding policy changes to prevent future abuses. They also agreed to support Robert in whatever legal action he decided to pursue against the HOA. Robert left the meeting feeling both encouraged and overwhelmed. The support from his neighbors was gratifying, but the situation had grown far beyond his original goal of simply running a small hay operation. He was now at the center of a community-wide battle over HOA governance and the rights of property owners. That weekend, Robert walked through his empty fields, trying to decide what to do next. The growing season was over, and replanting would have to wait until spring. But the bigger question was whether he wanted to continue fighting or simply move somewhere else where he could farm in peace. The answer came to him as he stood near his barn, looking at the flattened grass where his hay bales had been stolen. He had worked too hard and invested too much to give up now. Margaret Wellington had made a serious mistake when she decided to steal his property. Now she was going to learn what happened when someone pushed back. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old books, exactly what Robert expected from someone who specialized in property law. Attorney Susan Walsh had agreed to meet with Robert after seeing the news coverage, and her reputation for taking on difficult HOA cases made her the obvious choice for representation. Susan listened carefully as Robert explained the timeline of events, occasionally asking questions about documentation and witnesses. She seemed particularly interested in Robert's state certification and the agricultural protections that might apply to his situation. After reviewing the HOA, covenants, and Robert's correspondence with Margaret Wellington, Susan leaned back in her chair with a slight smile. The HOA had made several legal mistakes, she explained. Most importantly, they had failed to follow their own procedures for violation enforcement and had exceeded their authority by removing property without proper notice or due process. The self-help remedy of simply taking the hay bales was particularly problematic. Even if the HOA had legitimate concerns about covenant violations, they couldn't just remove property without following legal procedures. The action constituted theft under Colorado law, regardless of HOA authority. Susan outlined several potential legal strategies. They could file criminal complaints for theft, civil lawsuits for damages, and administrative complaints with the state agriculture department. The combination of approaches would put maximum pressure on the HOA to settle the case quickly. The criminal complaint was filed first. Robert provided Officer Rodriguez with additional documentation about the value of the stolen hay bales and evidence of the HOA's involvement. The district attorney's office agreed to investigate, though they warned that prosecuting HOA officials would require substantial evidence of criminal intent. While the criminal investigation proceeded, Susan filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for the stolen hay bales, lost income, and emotional distress. The lawsuit named both the HOA and Margaret Wellington personally, arguing that her actions exceeded the scope of her authority as board president. The lawsuit created immediate problems for the HOA. Their insurance company refused to provide coverage for Margaret's actions, arguing that theft fell outside the scope of normal HOA activities. Margaret would have to hire her own attorney and face potential personal liability for the full amount of damages. The other board members began distancing themselves from Margaret's decision. Several claimed they had never authorized the removal of Robert's hay bales and suggested Margaret had acted unilaterally. Board meeting minutes from the relevant time period mysteriously disappeared, making it difficult to determine exactly what had been discussed or approved. Meanwhile, David Park from the State Agriculture Department had completed his investigation. His findings were devastating for the HOA's position. Robert's state certification provided specific legal protections for his farming activities, and the removal of his hay bales violated state agricultural protection laws. Park's report recommended that the state attorney general's office investigate the HOA for interfering with licensed agricultural operations. The state could impose significant fines and require the HOA to implement new policies protecting agricultural activities within their jurisdiction. The media attention continued to grow as the legal battle escalated. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a symbol of HOA overreach and the conflict between suburban development and agricultural rights. Robert received interview requests from television shows and farming magazines across the country. The publicity created unexpected opportunities for Robert's farming operation. A local feed store offered to buy his entire next harvest at premium prices. Several horse owners contacted him about long-term hay supply contracts. A grant program for sustainable agriculture expressed interest in supporting his work. But the attention also brought new pressures. Robert received angry emails from HOA supporters who accused him of trying to destroy property values and community standards. Someone spray-painted "Farmer Go Home" on his barn door. Though neighborhood security cameras helped police identify and arrest the vandal, Margaret Wellington hired an expensive attorney and began fighting back aggressively. Her lawyer argued that the HOA had legitimate authority to enforce community covenants and that Robert's agricultural activities violated the residential character of the neighborhood. The legal battle became increasingly complex as both sides filed motions and counter-motions. Margaret's attorney sought to have the criminal charges dismissed, arguing that the removal of the hay bales was a civil matter related to covenant enforcement rather than criminal theft. Robert's case was strengthened when the Colorado Farm Bureau and several agricultural organizations filed amicus briefs supporting his position. The brief argued that protecting small-scale agriculture was essential for food security and environmental sustainability, and that HOAs couldn't simply override state agricultural policies. The breakthrough came when Susan Walsh obtained Margaret's personal emails through the legal discovery process. The emails revealed that Margaret had indeed authorized the hay bale removal, without board approval and had specifically instructed the removal company to dispose of the bales rather than storing them for potential return. More damaging was an email exchange between Margaret and another board member discussing the political benefits of taking strong action against Robert's farm nonsense. The emails showed clear premeditation and an understanding that their actions might be legally questionable. Armed with this evidence, Susan filed an amended lawsuit seeking punitive damages for willful misconduct. The emails demonstrated that Margaret had acted with full knowledge that her actions exceeded HOA authority and might violate Robert's legal rights. The HOA's legal position collapsed rapidly after the email revelations. Their attorney recommended immediate settlement, negotiations to avoid a trial that would likely result in substantial damages and widespread negative publicity for the community. The settlement discussions revealed the full extent of the HOA's financial exposure. Beyond the direct damages to Robert, the HOA faced potential fines from the state agriculture department, increased insurance premiums, and legal costs that were already approaching 6 figures. Several board members privately approached Robert about reaching a reasonable settlement. They expressed genuine regret about the situation and blamed Margaret's authoritarian leadership style for creating the crisis. Some suggested they had been afraid to oppose Margaret's decisions because of her history of retaliating against board members who disagreed with her. The community petition calling for Margaret's resignation had gathered nearly 200 signatures, representing more than half of the neighborhood's residents. Several people announced they would run against Margaret in the upcoming board elections, promising to reform HOA governance and prevent future abuses. Robert found himself in an unexpectedly strong negotiating position. The combination of criminal charges, civil lawsuits, state investigation, and community pressure had created multiple sources of leverage against the HOA and Margaret personally. But as the settlement negotiations progressed, Robert realized he wanted more than just financial compensation. The theft of his hay bales had revealed fundamental problems with HOA governance that would continue to affect his neighbors long after his case was resolved. Robert began thinking about long-term changes that could prevent future HOA overreach. He wanted policy reforms that would protect residents' rights, require transparency in board decision-making, and create accountability mechanisms for board members who exceeded their authority. The question was whether Margaret Wellington and the HOA board would agree to meaningful reforms, or whether they would continue fighting to preserve the status quo that had allowed the situation to develop in the first place. The settlement conference took place in a sterile conference room downtown, with lawyers representing all parties arranged around a polished mahogany table. Margaret Wellington sat stiffly beside her attorney, avoiding eye contact with Robert and his legal team. The mediator, a retired judge named Harrison, had a reputation for bringing even the most contentious disputes to resolution. Robert had spent the previous week thinking carefully about what he wanted from the settlement. The financial damages were important, but he had come to realize that money alone wouldn't address the systemic problems that had created this situation in the first place. Susan Walsh opened with a comprehensive presentation of Robert's case. The stolen hay bales were worth $8,000, but the total damages, including lost income, replacement costs, and business disruption, exceeded $25,000. The evidence of willful misconduct supported punitive damages that could triple that amount. Margaret's attorney responded with predictable arguments about HOA authority and community standards, but his presentation lacked conviction. The email evidence had undermined their legal position so completely that everyone in the room understood they were negotiating the terms of surrender rather than debating the merits of the case. The first settlement offer was insulting. The HOA would pay $5,000 in exchange for Robert, dropping all claims and agreeing never to engage in agricultural activities on his property. Robert rejected the offer immediately, and Susan made it clear they were prepared to go to trial if necessary. As the day progressed, the offers gradually improved. The HOA increased their financial offer and dropped some of their demands about restricting Robert's farming activities. But Robert remained focused on broader reforms that would protect all residents from future HOA overreach. Robert's counter-proposal surprised everyone in the room. He would accept $20,000 in damages, but only if the HOA agreed to comprehensive governance reforms. The new policies would require board votes for any enforcement actions, mandatory waiting periods before imposing fines, and independent arbitration for disputed violations. Most importantly, Robert demanded that the HOA formally recognize state-certified agricultural activities as protected uses that couldn't be restricted through covenant enforcement. The policy would prevent future conflicts between residents engaged in legal farming activities and overzealous board members. Margaret's attorney objected strenuously to the governance reforms, arguing that they would undermine the HOA's ability to maintain community standards. But Judge Harrison pointed out that the current system had already failed spectacularly, resulting in legal exposure that threatened the financial stability of the entire community. The breakthrough came when Pete Morrison and several other board members arrived at the conference room. They had called an emergency board meeting that morning and voted to remove Margaret as president, effective immediately. The new board leadership was prepared to accept Robert's terms and implement the reforms he proposed. Margaret's isolated position became clear as her own. Board members testified about her pattern of exceeding authority and ignoring proper procedures. Several described feeling intimidated by Margaret's aggressive leadership style and admitted they had failed to provide adequate oversight of her decisions faced with personal liability for the full amount of damages and potential criminal prosecution. Margaret finally agreed to the settlement terms. She would resign from the HOA board immediately and be permanently barred from seeking election to any board position. The HOA would pay Robert $25,000 and implement the governance reforms within 90 days. The criminal charges against Margaret were resolved through a plea agreement that required her to perform community service and pay restitution for the stolen hay bales. The district attorney's office was satisfied that the civil settlement and governance reforms addressed the underlying issues that had led to the criminal conduct. The state agriculture department dropped its investigation. After reviewing the proposed HOA policy changes, David Park praised the settlement as a model for protecting agricultural rights in residential communities and suggested that other HOAs might voluntarily adopt similar policies or use the settlement money to expand his farming operation and invest in better equipment. He planted additional fields that spring and doubled his hay production capacity. The publicity from his legal battle had generated so much interest in his hay that he had a waiting list of customers. The governance reforms transformed the HOA's relationship with residents. The new policies required transparency in all enforcement decisions and created appeal processes that protected residents from arbitrary or excessive penalties. Board meetings became more collaborative, with genuine discussion replacing Margaret's authoritarian decision-making style. Jenny finished her college degree and surprised everyone by deciding to join Robert's farming operation full-time. She brought fresh ideas about marketing and sustainable agriculture that helped expand the business beyond hay production. They added organic vegetables and herbs that sold at local farmers' markets. The neighborhood culture changed in unexpected ways after Margaret's departure. Residents felt more freedom to personalize their properties and pursue diverse interests without fear of HOA retaliation. The community garden that several neighbors had proposed for years was finally approved and became a popular gathering place. Pete Morrison was elected as the new HOA president, running on a platform of reasonable governance and respect for residents' rights. His leadership style emphasized cooperation over conflict, and most disputes were resolved through discussion rather than formal enforcement actions. Robert's relationship with his neighbors deepened as people learned more about his farming operation. He began offering educational tours for local school groups and hosting workshops on sustainable agriculture. The barn became a community resource where neighbors gathered to share tools and knowledge. The legal precedent set by Robert's case attracted attention from agricultural law experts and property rights advocates. Several other HOA agricultural disputes were resolved through negotiation rather than litigation, with Robert's settlement serving as a template for protecting farming rights in residential areas. Lisa returned to her own interests after years of supporting Robert's farming dreams. She started a small business making preserves and baked goods using produce from Robert's expanded operation. Their kitchen became a hub of activity as neighbors stopped by to buy fresh vegetables and homemade treats. 3 years after the hay bale theft, Robert's operation had grown into a legitimate small farm that employed several part-time workers and supplied produce to restaurants throughout the Denver area. The success validated his belief that suburban agriculture could be both economically viable and environmentally beneficial. Margaret Wellington moved to a different community. After her resignation from the HOA board, neighbors occasionally saw her driving through the old neighborhood, but she never stopped or attempted to contact any of her former adversaries. Her house sold quickly to a young family who appreciated the community's new culture of tolerance and cooperation. The story of the stolen hay bales became neighborhood legend, told to new residents as an example of how communities could overcome conflict and create positive change. Robert kept a photo of his original hay bales in his office, not as a reminder of the theft, but as a symbol of the unexpected consequences that could flow from standing up for what was right. Robert often reflected on how a simple dispute over hay bales had transformed not just his own life, but the entire character of his community. The theft that had seemed like a devastating setback had ultimately created opportunities for growth, connection, and positive change that none of them could have imagined. The irony wasn't lost on Robert that Margaret's attempt to eliminate his farming operation had instead led to its expansion and success. Her authoritarian approach to community governance had backfired completely, creating the very changes she had tried to prevent. Sometimes Robert realized the best way to win was simply to refuse to give up.